joining us today, Shoaib. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Hi, everyone. My name is Shoaib. I used to be a professor at Zayed University in Dubai. I'm currently working as a freelancer, and my area of focus is science and religion. So just to, provide a little bit of history to my work, I was an engineer before. So my first PhD was in chemical engineering. And then, as you do, in the middle of my engineering degree, I realized, oh no, this is not for me. I want to do theology. It's my professor, who was an atheist. He kept asking me questions about religion and Islam, and I was a very cultural Muslim back then. I didn't know much, and that kind of set me on path to discovering the field of science and religion. And so now I'm actively contributing to this area. I acquired my second PhD in theology just recently from St. Mary's University, and I'm kind of trying to develop the field of Islamic science. So that's a bit of an overview about my work and where I'm coming from.
Now, there's a lot of people who are working in the field of science and religion. It's my own field, but you're working in a field specifically in science and Islam. How many people in academia would you say are really delving into that rather than the more traditional science and Christianity? Is this an emerging field, or are you sort of a lone horseman, riding out valiantly to sort of carve out a new path?
Right. I think that's a phenomenal question. And it's something that I was asking myself as I was, going through the work that was out there. It seems like infrastructurally, there isn't a field known as Islamic science. I think that's what we're seeing now. But in terms of works being, that were written on Islamic science, you could stretch that back to maybe the 1960s, 70s, 80s. I think the 1980s is when you start seeing an explosion of literature. So you have stuff like, the Islamization of science. That was a big movement back in the 1980s. You had talks about the scientific miracles in the Quran, which was another movement that started. And then we also see the development of the impact of medical developments on Islamic legal theory. So stuff like, in vitro fertilization, supportive parenting, that kind of stuff. So we see the threads of Islamic thought and its relation to science being developed in the 1980s, particularly in the English language. But in terms of the actual formation of the field, that's very recent. And particularly in 2023, we see two important developments occurring. One, we now have an Islamic science micrograph series with Cambridge Elements. So that's a major development. That's being co-edited by Nadal Gassoum and Stefano Bigliardi. And myself, I'm the chief editor of Palgrave's newly established monograph series on Islamic science, so we're welcoming submissions for that. In addition to that, Palgrave has also established an Islamic science encyclopedia, the world's first as well. So I think we're at the cusp of seeing this field blossom and develop. So maybe in 10, 20 years' time, we'll have a lot more literature in this area. In terms of how many people are active in this field, I think that 20 years ago, I think it was just maybe a handful of people, maybe 5. Right? I think now we have more, but they wouldn't necessarily, not all of them would necessarily call themselves, I am active members of Islamic science. They're just kind of doing their own thing. Like, for example, we have some people who specialize in Islamic legal theory, but it just so happens that their focus is on certain medical problems like organ transplantation or AI, for instance. So they consider themselves as, Islamic scholars or Islamic studies scholars, not necessarily Islamic science scholars. So I think there's a definitional problem there, perhaps. But in terms of like key active members, I think there are about maybe 10, 15, including myself. So it's an emerging field. It's an emerging field.
Well, Muslims and Christians have quite a few beliefs in common. Could you give us a sense of where that overlap is and what some of the common beliefs we share are?
Yeah, so I think that when it comes to these are the two biggest, of the three, the two biggest, traditions in the Abrahamic world. And naturally, they have a lot of overlap. One is that they both believe in a monotheistic God. Both believe that this world has good and evil in it. Both believe there's a hereafter, right? And those are three very important core tenets across all three traditions. Where they probably differ is perhaps just maybe in the conceptions of God and the nature of Christ. I think that's a key difference there. But in terms of the core features, I think there's a lot of overlap. And that's why you see, particularly when it comes to, conversations with atheists or agnostics, theists can, coalesce into one umbrella. despite acknowledging certain differences between themselves. So they see this as part of maybe a bigger discussion when it comes to people outside of the faith.
So just kind of going off of that, you talked about the nature of Jesus. How do Muslims look at Jesus? Because obviously as Christians, we see him as the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, the Messiah, the Lord and Savior. Where is Islam at in that?
Right. So Islam does not believe that any individual, any man can become God. And the primary reason behind that is that any contingent being cannot be part of a necessary being. And so they see Jesus not as having any properties of divinehood. Rather, they classify him as a prophet, one of many, many noble prophets. And so Jesus is actually revered in Islamic thought, but just in a different way to the way Christians look up to him. And I think that plays a very important role in terms of how they do a lot of discussions in theology, but also interfaith dialogues, as well as science and religion, because that key concept of the second coming of Christ is interpreted very differently, and also how it's related to original sin, which is also not considered an axiom in Islamic thought, is also an important difference. So I think that's how Islam sees it. He's a prophet. He's a very noble prophet, and it's actually an obligation to believe that he is a revered prophet. In fact, it's so strict that if you don't believe that he's a prophet, you're outside the fold of Islam. That's how strict, this doctrine is. So he's very highly revered in Islamic thought, with obvious differences with Christianity.
Well, you were talking about the overlap there. Both Christians and Muslims obviously believe in God and a monotheistic God. Do we both equally use the traditional arguments for God's existence? Would you enlist all of those same basic philosophical arguments for God?
Yeah, this is something that I'm exploring at the moment, and it's fascinating. I think there's a lot of overlap in the traditional arguments for God's existence. So the key ones are, the contingency argument, KCA, design arguments, its variations, right? Of course, with design arguments in particular, we see an increasing sophistication in light of modern science, FTA, and all of that. So I do believe that a lot of the traditional arguments are similar. And that's because, there were two translation movements, right? So we've had a lot of corpus from the Greeks that went into the Islamic world around the 7th, 8th century. And then we had the second translation movement where a lot of the corpus of Aristotle and Plato, it went back to medieval Europe. And that's where, Aquinas was able to pick up a lot of the arguments and it was synthesize it with the Catholic Church. So I think there's always going to be prosody across the two traditions, and that naturally there's going to be a lot of overlap in the arguments. Where there are certain differences, and this is something that I picked up maybe a few years ago, is that the ontological argument seems to be at the moment a uniquely Christian development. Very interestingly, the ontological argument seems to be a very uniquely Christian development. I cannot at the moment seem to find, a variation of the ontological argument as it was presented by St. Alsam in the Islamic corpus. That's very interesting. So that is something that I picked up on. With regards to the other arguments, the argument from consciousness, I think that is more of a modern development. I don't think it was ever used as an argument, at least classically by Muslim scholars. If they do, it will most likely be a modern movement. And I think it gained life, particularly after J.P. Moreland's work, when it came into fruition. But I don't see that. I haven't seen that as an argument for God's existence. Rather, I see that as an argument for human nature and human uniqueness, as opposed to proving God. So,
can you,
those. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can you just explain for our listeners who might not be familiar with the argument from consciousness? What is that argument?
Oh, right. So the argument from consciousness is this. It's a simple argument that we seem to have a lot of features as human beings that cannot be stripped down to physical matter, right? So things like qualia, first person, subjectiveness, right? Raw feelings, qualitative aspects to us. And no matter how hard we try and analyze that first personhood through science, we always have this gap. And this is known as the Hart problem of consciousness. And so the question is, what grounds this subjective aspect? It's not something you can empirically quantify. It's not something you can kind of tap into scientifically. So it seems to suggest that consciousness, which is our raw feeling, right? Our first personhood, cannot be derived from physical matter. And therefore, there might be a suggestion that there's another ontology at work here. What grounds that ontology? What is that stuffness, in addition to this physical stuffness? That can only be best explained by theism. So it's at least the way I set it up, it's an argument from abduction, so inference is the best explanation. So you have some physical options on the table, and individuals like J.P. Moreland, what he tries to do is that all the physical options that we have on the table are insufficient. They fall short. It's one way or another, right? You can't ground it physically. And therefore, a better explanation is theism is the better way of concluding that this is something that's divinely inserted. So that's an overview of the argument.
So we talked a little bit about some of these other arguments. We talked about the ontological argument and a few others on one of our podcasts just a few weeks ago. We didn't have a lot of nice things to say about the ontological argument, unfortunately. But yeah. we did with, like, say, the design argument and cosmological arguments. But we always took this from obviously a very Christian perspective. Have Muslim theologians and philosophers from the past contributed to these arguments? It seems like you're saying that they have. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I actually teach courses on proofs for God's existence. And so we have like 4 levels. The first level is called 8 proofs of God's existence. And the first one that we do is the ontological argument. Suffice to say, it's the least popular argument in the course. I always have this feedback form at the end. What's your strongest argument? What's your weakest argument? And all of them, they either I think 90% put the ontological argument as the worst argument they've ever come across. And the other the other argument is usually either the moral argument or the argument from design on specific skills, like biological design. Now, with respect to your question about have Muslims contributed to literature, I think so. I mean, it's very evident that Islamic scholars have contributed to literature. In fact, most of the treatises that we find in theology, they actually begin with proving God's existence. Before anything, they usually start with proving God's existence. And it happens usually, either in a compounded way, so you look at variations, or, they focus on one and they use that. So the most popular one, as I said, is the Kalam cosmological argument. And this was revived, at least in the English literature, by William Lane Craig. He actually took it from Ghazali's corpus to try and breathe new life into it. So Ghazali was a very, very important proponent. Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, known in Arabic, right? So he was well known for propounding the contingency argument. And actually, there's this well-known division in Islamic thought between Muslim philosophers and Muslim theologians, right? Now, this may seem like an artificial division, but it has historical roots. What we mean by Muslim philosophers in this historical context is the works of Plato and Aristotle, who were borrowed and taken up, and they were gelled with Islam very, very tightly. And there were a few key thinkers. So we had Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, right? And these guys became known as the Muslim philosophers. The Muslim theologians are the Kalam scholars. So people like Al-Ghazali and Al-Razi and a few others. And they had beef between them in terms of how to understand the nature of the world, the nature of God, and nature of contingency, and what have you. So, for example, borrowing from Aristotle, Avicenna believed that the universe was eternal, whereas Ghazali said no. There's a point at which time was created. So that's a very important difference between the two. And this is articulated in that very famous text, Incoherence of the Philosophers. Now, with respect to, so this is a very, very important document because it contains some deep philosophical insights about, how to prove God's existence. And it plays a role into that. That's why many Christian scholars are also interested in Ghazali's works, because they want to see the metaphysical differences between these two schools of thought. Design argument is naturally an important contender because you see that not just in theological treatises, but also in spiritual treatises. It's a natural way of kind of gaining proximity to God. And of course, back in the day, design arguments were rudimentary in comparison to what we have now. So you look at the world, you can see intelligence, you can see markers of intelligence, things like the honeycomb, things like trees, things like human beings, things like the eye. And so they're able to draw inferences from there to argue that this could not have come out by chance. It must have been designed by a creator who has a mind, who has intelligence, who has power. So a lot of overlaps there. And I think that this corpus is still being mined at the moment. One of the problems with gaining access to the Islamic tradition is you need to know Arabic, classical Arabic in particular, right? And I think that's why even though we have amazing philosophers, they may sometimes not know the classical Arabic, which is why they're kind of barred and they have to rely on second literature. And some scholars who do know classical Arabic, they may not be interested in the philosophy stuff. They just want to do whatever stuff they want to do in Arabic. And so I think that kind of bars people sometimes from gaining access to literature. But slowly, I think over time, we're now seeing more and more people who have, training in both. And we're seeing more and more works coming out that are trying to articulate and express the Islamic tradition in modern terms. So yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff that'll be coming out in the next few years or so.
I love that you brought up the incoherence of the philosophers, because wasn't there a response book to that called something like The Incoherence of the Incoherence?
Yeah. So this is the triangular mix, right? So you've got Avicenna, who is the first guy, and Ghazali responded to him, and then Ibn Rushd, Averroes, responded to Ghazali, and so there's like this triangular mix between these three guys, right? Who was right, who's wrong? And there's a phenomenal book that just came out last year by Edward Moad. He's a trained philosopher. He wrote a book called I think it's called The Nature of the Cosmos, and it's published by Georgius Press. He, I think, does a beautiful job in actually explaining to a modern audience on the nature of cosmos, like the contingency, eternality, how they differed across these three thinkers, and he provides clear articulations of each person, and then gives his own critical thoughts. So I think this is going to be a phenomenal text that'll be picked up in philosophy circles and science and religion circles in particular. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of overlap clearly here when we're talking about philosophical arguments for Islam and for Christianity. But Christians might also throw in a very different type of apologetic, say from like the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus, the types of arguments that are very particular to our specific religious claim. Does Islam have arguments that are also particular to its claims? Right. Historical arguments, scientific arguments, that sort of thing.
Right, yeah. So there is this argument that the Quran is a miracle, right? That's a very popular conception, and that is the basis for a lot of Islam being true, at least how Muslims articulate it, right? But I just want to differentiate this from the more popular narrative that there are scientific miracles in the Quran. This new narrative started off in the 1960s, right? This is not something that's intrinsic to the Islamic tradition. This kicked off with people like Maurice Bucaille. He was a very famous French physicist, and he kind of made certain connections between modern science and Islamic scripture. And that somehow propelled into this massive narrative that you still see today. So I guarantee you, if you go to any mosque, whether in the UK or the US, you'll find at least one pamphlet saying they're scientific from the Quran. This has been heavily criticized by both traditional scholars as well as academics, just because of the problems that it has. It stretches certain words. It overloads certain words that don't have any bearings in there. Like I remember reading one paper that there are black holes in the Quran, but there's nothing like that whatsoever in the Quran, right? So it's just unbelievable how people. I mean, look, they do it out of sincerity, right? And I think anyone who does something out of sincerity, there's some good there. But I think if it's wrongheaded, it needs to be articulated. This is wrongheaded. I remember another one where people derive the speed of light from the Quran. I'm like, how on earth did you do that, right? Like some fanciful mathematics. So I'm personally very critical of this movement. I don't have positive things to say about this. What the actual basis of the Quran is that it is considered as a literary miracle, meaning that it has certain prose and metric that cannot be matched. And to explain this, I need to explain how Muslims conceive of miracles in the Islamic tradition. At least the Kalam tradition, so there's the same tradition that Ghazali occupies, right? A miracle is conceived not as a proof for divinity, but it's a proof of prophethood. That's an important difference. It's a proof of prophethood, not divinity. Once you prove prophethood through a miracle, then whatever the prophet says, be it in the form of revelation or his personal words, that then becomes the basis for believing in divinity. But in terms of Islamic theology, belief in God is independent of revelation and prophethood. That you can actually make the argument for God's existence independently. Believing in God, you can believe in the necessary being and you can derive certain attributes from there. Then tying it down to Islam, that's where the challenge of the miracle comes in. Now, coming back to my point that it's a proof of prophethood, Islamic thought has this understanding that each prophet was given a certain kind of miracle based on the specialization of the community it was delivered to. So, for example, in the case of Jesus, Muslims believe that all his prophets were related to medicine, right? Curing sicknesses, curing blindness. bringing people back from the dead, for instance, right? And those were because the people at the time were known for their medicine. With Moses, the people at the time, at least in the time of Pharaoh, were known for their magic. So he was given specific miracles that challenged their magic that couldn't be explained by the magician at the time. Same way, the people of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, they were experts of the Arabic language. And so they had very complicated literary prose, the metrics and rhymes and what have you. And this is not the time to go into that detail, but that was the benchmark. And so this was an articulate response brought in the form of revelation that challenged the Arabs. And the narrative goes, they couldn't meet that challenge. And the form and the bedrock for the miracle is that this is an inimitable basis for the miracle, that it cannot be matched, therefore it's a miracle, therefore it proves prophethood. And that challenge remains open today. It's not a historical miracle, so it's not something that's buried in the past. It is a challenge that is open till now.
Have you seen any sort of philosophical, academic defenses of this argument? Is there a way that this can even be done?
So yeah, this is something that I'm thinking about, and the closest that I've seen in terms of philosophical defense, not like a theological or an apologetic defense, I think is an article by Zain Ali. He has this article, I think, in Haythrop Journal, which I think is now shut down, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong, but I think it was shut down, or maybe Haythrop College was shut down. Maybe the journal selected. But he published an article in there in which he engaged with the thoughts of William Lane Craig, and he kind of alludes to this, but nothing more sophisticated than that. I think this is going to be an active area of research in terms of philosophical articulation. One of the things that I'm looking at personally is, for example, now that we have AI, we live in a world that's ushered in by AI, right? So where perhaps we're going to see some things that we never imagined. Now, if AI learns all the classical Arabic, classical poetry, because that's the metric, right? That's the metric. So if it learns all the rules of grammar, could it match the Quran? Yes or no? And what are the implications of each response? So I'm thinking about this, and I hope that other people are thinking about it as well. And maybe that can be brought into philosophical fruition.
What are some of the features that are normally pointed out that are sort of unmatched in the Quran for, I'm guessing, most of our listeners who haven't read it?
Right. So I think this is where the Arabic language becomes important, right? I think we live in a world where, and I'm saying this just from personal experiences, I think we treat language very functionally, right? English in particular is a very functional language. I think it doesn't have a lot of rhyme or poetry behind it. I think classical English may have had that, but maybe not so much in modern day. Like we can throw in anything now and it becomes a word in English, right? Facebook is in the dictionary, for example. Google's in the dictionary, right? So whereas I think in classical Arabic, there are certain metrics that are used. So for example, we have things like prose, metric, rhetoric that can be used as well, and poetry. So, for example, there are certain verses that are matched that have the same ending. There are also like something called ring circles in the Quran. So the same idea is brought back into a loop circle. So if you look at a whole surah or a whole chapter, the beginning matches with the end. The second statement matches the second statement. So they find these internal patterns that show sophistication. And these studies are not done by Muslim scholars. These are studies done by non-Muslim scholars. They're finding these patterns in the Quran. And so now how much you want to stretch that as a point of miracle, this comes back against the context. So the Prophet is assumed to be unlettered, that he was not an educated person in the sense that, he wasn't trained to be an academic. He wasn't, a scholar. He was just he was a shepherd at the beginning, but he was a businessman. That was his profession. And then on top of that, the Quran was revealed over 23 years. And there's a lot of room for error, right? I mean, like if something is and it wasn't even revealed in order. So the Quran that you hold from A to Z, that's not the order of the Quran. The order of revelation is not the order of the original Quran that you hold in your hands. And so when you kind of put all those contextual background, all those contextual indicators together, the argument goes that the aesthetic value, the rhetoric involved, the precision of the Arabic involved, all of that make it very difficult to achieve it. And there was a debate amongst Muslim scholars, believe it or not, about the nature of the miracle. There was a debate. Is this an intrinsic miracle or is this an extrinsic miracle? What do I mean by that, right? Is the Quran intrinsically a miracle? Like there are internal features that cannot be matched? Or is it extrinsic such that if somebody does try to match it, God intervenes and stops him? So that's an interesting area I think that can be explored, that I think will be of amazing interest to circles of science, religion, as well as philosophy. I'm so these are the areas that I'm thinking about. That's why I haven't penned anything down, because I want more time to do research in this area. But hopefully that gives you an overview.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like really this is a field looking to be developed even further. So it'll be really interesting what comes out of this in the coming years.
Yeah.
If I can return real quick, because I am really fascinated, can you speak a little bit more about these scientific aspects of the Quran, the supposed?
So believe it or not, we have Muslims who I mean, they like I said, I think on both sides, right? I think they're well-intending Christians, well-intending Muslims who are trying to do their best to show, Christianity is correct or Islam is correct, and they will use whatever means possible to advance their narratives, right? So I don't question the intention, but I think the methodology is wrong, precisely because there's a lot of anachronism involved, right? So this is when you take modern ideas and impose it onto a very old text that doesn't have the bearings of modern conceptions. So the idea, for example, that there's a black hole. Black hole was not known to the Prophet, right? It wasn't known to his disciples. So to say that they were talking about black holes is a massive error. And what happens is, unfortunately, they'll take like a certain verse that has some meaning of like a celestial body, and it has other connotations such as it making sounds, right? And so the word has those connotations, for instance. And recently we found out that black holes, if you pick up the traces, it makes like these knocking sounds. And I remember seeing a whole video 10 years ago, like, wow, this is like amazing and all of that. And people use that for, building up their spiritual basis for connecting with the scripture, right? That's one. I've even seen atomism being discussed in the Quran, right? The Quran predicted the atom, right? Whereas the word in Arabic is dhurra. Dhurra just literally means the smallest thing that you can conceive. So back in the day, right, the smallest thing that you could probably see was like a grain of sand, like mustard seed or something like that. And in contemporary vernacular, when we want to say the smallest thing, we usually use the word atom, right? That's the vernacular of the day. I'm sure if in 200 years times from now, if string theory is correct, you'll see the translations mentioning strings. And I'm sure some ignorant person is going to say, the Quran predicted the string theory. There we go. In your face, right? So I'm sure we're going to see stuff like that, right? So I think that this is highly problematic. And I do believe that it comes down to, I honestly believe that this is a form of religious scientism, where we're trying to use now science as a metric to kind of boost our theological narratives in a way that is misleading and misinformed. That's my understanding. And whereas I think a common understanding, at least amongst the academic class, is that you never treat the Quran as a book of science. It doesn't contain scientific information. And yet at the same time, we're kind of using science to prove the Quran is correct, not realizing at the same time when you believe in miracles. Right, so I mean, it's just a very incoherent narrative. I just find the whole thing quite bizarre. I'm personally very critical of it. When I teach it to my students as well, I say, "This is the narrative. What do you guys make of it?" And in the beginning, all my students were like, "Yeah, this is it. This is the argument." And then by the end of it, they're like, "Oh, yeah, you're right. So maybe we need to question this," because these are very deep-seated beliefs that people have. Very deep-seated beliefs, right? And so when I show them a particular argument, like, here's one. Perhaps I don't know if it exists in the Christian circles, but we have one conception where it talks about the sun and the moon, and they use slightly different words for the sun and the moon. And the word for the moon is nur. Nur just means light, right? But some people impose on it that says reflected light, right? The moon doesn't have its own intrinsic light; it has reflected light. Not knowing that the Greeks actually talked about this. So and remember, you got to bear in mind that in 7th century Arabia, there were two superpowers, the Greeks and the Persians, right? And that's why they had their trade done through Arabia, both sides. And so could this idea not have been known? Yes, it could. Another very famous one is there's a verse in chapter 55 where the two waters meet, two bodies of water meet. And this is usually interpreted as fresh water and seawater, where you get estuaries and you have this divide. I don't know if you guys have seen that. When fresh and seawater meet up, they have like a divide, and they say, yeah, look, the Quran predicted it. But if you look at the trading routes of Arabia back then, many people used to trade all the way from Africa to India. And you have a lot of estuaries down those trading routes. Could they not have known? So what makes it so miraculous, right? So when you kind of give that historical context, you kind of go through the Arabic a little bit, you see that to claim these are miracles is problematic. At best, you can say these are possible suggestions, but not not a miracle. I think that the epistemic bar is way too high to claim these things as miraculous.
Well, one of the interesting arguments I've heard is that Muhammad was illiterate and so could not have been the author of the Quran. Could you tell us a bit about this argument and your thoughts upon it?
Yeah, so all the records seem to indicate that the Prophet was a very simple man, right? He was not from a scholarly class. In fact, the scholarly class in that period were Christians and Jews who lived in Arabia at the time, right? And there's a whole discussion about what were particularly Jews, what were they doing? And some indications seem to suggest that they were waiting for the promised prophet, right? Anyways, so he comes from a family of Arabs, the Qurayshi Arabs, right? And in his early life, what we know from the sources is that he was a shepherd. Later on, he got to marry his first wife, Khadija. She hired him on as a businessman, and then she eventually married him. And so he would travel. But in terms of all our records, we don't have any indication whatsoever that he was, a scholarly person. And so as a result of that, that seems to be the basis for claiming that the Quran, which is understood to be as a very sophisticated piece, not of just like of literary genre, but it also has a lot of ideas that have impacted so many people worldwide. How can an illiterate person do that? And it all comes down to your evaluation of the sources. If you believe that the historical preservation is correct, you believe that these sources have authenticity, you will come to believe that this is very unlikely. If you don't, you will question the character of the Prophet Muhammad and therefore the Islamic narrative. So I think this is where historical work is being done to kind of make that. But across all scholarly, academic, and seminary circles, this is a well-known thing about Islam, that he was an unlettered individual.
Kind of on that, though, I think you mentioned he was a businessman. Would businessmen in that period have normally been illiterate?
Right. So unlettered here means I'm talking about academic class, right? Being able to read or write. Businessmen in this context means somebody who would, they would have merchandise and they would trade. So Mecca and Medina were trading spots. So what happens is if you load up a map of the Middle East, so the international trading hub back in the day, right, would be a place like in Yemen. And so you would have trading routes from India and Africa going towards Yemen. And then you have a land trading line from Yemen all the way up to the Greeks and the Romans. So you'd pass through Mecca, Medina. So Mecca and Medina were like well-known stations for travel and for business. And so he was part of that culture, right? And that's what he would do. That's what he would do. He would sell things, and he was known for actually taking retreats, which I find very interesting. So if you study him, he would on many occasions, he would just leave society. And remember, when we talk about society, we don't mean like 1,000 or like, a million people. We're talking about like maybe a couple of hundred people. So everyone knows each other. He would regularly take breaks and just, go to the cave and meditate. And then that's actually where he got his first revelation. Archangel Gabriel came to him in that cave. There's a specific cave, Mount Hira. And I find that very, very interesting. But yeah, coming to your point, what I specifically mean is the academic class. In fact, when he got his first revelation, he actually went running to his wife. He thought he was going crazy. And his wife consoled him. He's like, go speak to a family member. And this family member was a Christian scholar. This is somebody who was a scholarly person. The name escapes me now, but it was a Christian scholar. And he was the one who told the Prophet, that's Archangel Gabriel who came to see you. Right?
Awesome. Well, you've spent a good chunk of your career in largely Christian circles. What is some advice you might give to Christians for how to have a faithful interfaith dialogue?
Right.
Or how to do it better?
Right.
Not a faithful, how to have a fruitful interfaith dialogue.
Well, I don't see them as being exclusive. You can still have a fruitful dialogue that's still faithful. So, all right. My reason for spending a lot of time with Christian scholars is precisely because I think that there's a lot to learn from other traditions. I don't believe that we should exist in silos. I believe that we live in a market of knowledge. We are now a very knowledge-centric economy, more so than ever before in the past, right? And so good ideas, whether they come from your own tradition, from somebody else's, I think you should go out and engage. And I'm invested in the field of science and religion. And who are the leaders of this field? Mostly Christian scholars, right? So naturally, my investment is trying to learn from the best individuals. So my own, for example, mentor, Mark Harris, he was a professor at the University of Edinburgh. He's now the main guy at Ian Ramsay Center at the University of Oxford. He recently got hired there. He's a lovely chap. And, he's a Christian, I'm Muslim, but I can, and I say this with complete transparency. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here today. Hands down. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here today. I took up the online program on MSc in Science and Religion that they were offering starting 2017. I was one of the first few students to do the program. And he just, helped me in every direction. He actually got my first contract. The book Islam and Evolution that got published with Routledge? He was actually the one who contracted that book. He's the one who said, write a proposal. We'll consider it for our series. He has his own book series with Routledge, right, in Science and Religion. I submitted it. Being a junior scholar, I had no hopes. Like literally, I had zero hopes. I remember I was in Iran at the time, and I was there with my wife. I was chilling, and I get an email from Routledge, and I opened the email, and I was shocked. I was like literally, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move that they accepted the proposal. That was Mark Harris. He was the one who supported me whenever I have had issues, be it in terms of funding, when I've had problems. Mark Harris has always been there for me. And so he's been a pillar of support, and has helped me from strength to strength. And from him, I learned patience and humility in terms of engaging across faiths, but also across disciplines. He's somebody who's kind of, very proficient in the field. And everything that I do, I credit to him, because I think he really helped me as an individual, as an academic, particularly, in the field of science and religion. Now, in terms of how to have successful dialogues and helpful dialogues that are both faithful and fruitful, I think you should just be transparent and acknowledge that you come from different traditions, and then work with that. I think the problem is that when we make those meeting points places of polemics as opposed to just exchanges, that's when you get friction, I think. Not that I don't have a problem with, discussing faith beliefs and all of that. Why do you believe Christianity? Why do I believe Islam? I've never had that, right? But I can only have that with certain people who I believe are genuine. But when you have sometimes hidden agendas, and I say this, I think from both sides, this occurs. I think that's when I think problems arise. For me, I think just, accept the fact that people are from different traditions. Acknowledge that. I think that's the first premise. Second premise is you're here to learn from one another. I am here generally. I have studied a lot of Christian theology, believe it or not. I have, most of my books are on Christian theology and science and religion. And I go out of my way to kind of understand that, because I want to know the layers of complexity and how these things are moving and shaking and how the conversations are evolving. And for me, that's interesting, just because I'm invested in the field of science and religion. And I think generally, if people are invested in overlapping interests, they make room for fruitful dialogues, for faithful engagements. One clear example, and Seth, I think you were there. We were at the AAR, right? Joshua Swamidas is a very good friend of mine. I've only met him a few times, but it feels like I know him for ages, and we just click, right? And that's because I think both of us come from scientific backgrounds. We then, point of face towards theology. We also talk about evolution very passionately and how it relates to our respective traditions. But in no way have we ever tread on each other's foots. We've all respected, our respective differences, and we're very casual about it. And I think those are areas where I think we can have fruitful dialogue and just being honest and being transparent. I don't know. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
I think that's a great start. And yes, I love Joshua Swamidas. We got to hang out a little bit at AAR too. But you brought up a real important topic that we got to hit home on, which is evolution. Because you have to talk about it if we're going to do science and religion. Christianity. We've talked ad nauseum on this podcast about it. We've had multiple different guests come on from all different perspectives. Can you give us a bit of an insight on how Islam is dealing with that internally? Is it more accepting, or is it more rejecting? Where is it at?
So I think the who, when, and where are important here, right? Who do you ask? When do you ask? And where are you asking them? In some parts of the Muslim world, evolution is not a problem. In most parts of the world, I think it is a problem. And I think it's because of a historical narrative that's been linked to evolution. So when evolution first came into the Muslim world, we're talking about 100 years ago, it largely came in through missionary institutions, Christian missionary institutions, right? And naturally, when it came through those institutions, it came with a lot of baggage, creationist baggage. And I think that set like a bad tone in a lot of people's minds. So if you look at the early responses to evolution, 100 years ago, it's linked with Marxism, communism, the same kind of arguments you see back in the day. Today, it's not more about, ID and intelligent design, right? I think that has steeped up a lot. And we actually know certain individuals like Harun Yahya, Adnan Oktar, I don't know if you guys know him, but Harun Yahya is a massive individual So he copied a lot of the creationist literature, put it into Turkish and English and Arabic and what have you, and he distributed this everywhere in this world. And so you have this kind of stigma with evolution. Evolution has also become part of the colonial conversation, right? Colonization, right? In the sense that, some people treat evolution, the West think it's, so we have this East versus West divide sometimes. And that's because this is the aftermath of colonization, right? Anything new, anything modern seems to be like a foreign invention, and it's being imposed onto Islamic thought. So the moment you try to discuss new things, evolution just being one of them, it doesn't have to be evolution, it can be anything else, right? Modern science in general, right? This is a Western product. This is, this is something that we have to cleanse Islamically, right? And this is another one of those political schemes, like COVID wars. When COVID hit, oh my God, the amount of discussions that we had. There were some people who genuinely believe, I mean, maybe they had their basis for these, but they believe that COVID lockdown was just a way of the government controlling mosque access. And so that's why still certain imams went in and they died as a result of COVID, right? So I think that there are certain problems that kind of coalesce around evolution. One is the education of evolution on a public level. The education level is, I mean, it's a very steep battle. I mean, just to understand evolution, clarify it, it's a steep learning curve. Number two, also, theologically, how do we engage with it? We don't actually touch the theology because we think this is a Western product and we want to criticize this Western product, right? So I think theology is always insulated. Whereas I think the whole purpose of theology is that you engage with the discussions of the day, right? Every era has its new challenges. We previously had maybe cosmology, maybe that was the big battle of the day. Today it's evolution, tomorrow it's AI, right? New challenges, new environments, new opportunities, new discussions. I think when theology remains insulated, it becomes ossified, it becomes static, it becomes irrelevant. And I think that's what's happening here. And also, I think there's also infrastructural problems. Because of colonization, there was a rift between seminary scholars and universities, right? So what do I mean by that? Previously, all education was streamlined through something called madrasas, where everyone who wanted to be educated, they had to go through seminary systems because you would be taught the latest science as well as the Islamic studies of the day. When colonization, sorry, that's my mobile. So when colonization impacted the Muslim world, a rift was created. So you had the seminary track, but then you also had these imposed institutions where people implemented schools and universities. And here, Islamic studies was diluted or non-existent. And so what we see is we have people who are amazing now in their engineering, in their social studies, in their psychology, but they have very little relevance or very little conversation with the Islamic theology. And you have seminary students who are proficient, in their seminary studies, but they don't know how to engage with stuff like quantum mechanics. And that's why if you see, one of the complaints that you find amongst many lay Muslims is, I cannot speak to my imam. I don't know. What is the answer to evolution? I don't know. What is the answer to quantum mechanics? I don't know. What is the answer to, multiverses? I don't know, right? And so what we're seeing now, and this is this interesting phase we see sociologically, is that we're seeing a phase where people are trying to marry both traditions and trying to come up with these intersections, which is why Islamic science, I think, will play a very important role. So given that historical background, evolution is a sensitive conversation. It really is. Why? Because it hits many different lines at the same time. It forces you to understand the placement of human beings, which we generally believe that, they're the most important creation. Right? Human beings are the most important creation. Evolution challenges that to some extent. So does exotheology and so does AI, right? I think those are new conversations that are going to intersect with evolution on that front. It also challenges on how you evaluate hermeneutics in relation to science. So science and scripture, like how do you balance that relationship? I think people, because of this ossified tradition, perhaps, or maybe this understanding that the tradition is very ossified, it's fixed. People don't want to question authority. They don't want to go against the mold, right? That's also something that's there. Evolution has also strongly become linked with atheism, right? And I think here, people like Richard Dawkins, I think frankly speaking, he's done a phenomenal job. He's done a phenomenal marketing job in convincing people evolution equals atheism. And I think that's why the moment and the fourth one is secularism and colonialism, imperialism, right? So we actually have academic articles showing, sociological studies showing that I don't believe in evolution. This is another way of forcing Muslims to believe ideas that they don't have to believe, and it becomes part and parcel of secularism, right? So putting all those four together, you can naturally see it's a very, very difficult conversation to have in some circles. Slowly now, however, over time, the conversation is becoming much more public. So I've done my part in trying to make evolution, at least the science of evolution, much more accessible, clarify misconceptions. Like natural selection does not mean naturalism, One is a mechanism, one is a philosophy, right? One is a worldview. Not random mutations does not necessarily mean God doesn't know what he's doing, because some people consider random mutations to mean that God's control and power is gone. Like, do we believe in a dumb or stupid God, right? If it's all open ended. And then the simple analogy I give is toss a coin. Who did that, right? God ultimately created that, right? Does that mean that God doesn't exist or God is stupid? Of course not. So same thing when it comes to random mutations, right? So I think that education, accessibility is helping the conversation. My book has been translated to now multiple languages, so Arabic, Bahasa Indonesian, Urdu, and I think that's facilitating dialogue, constructive dialogue, hopefully. I've only to date have had one fatwa against me declaring me a heretic or declaring my ideas to be, which is good. That's a good thing. I consider that an achievement. Generally, it's been a very, very good run. I'm enjoying how the book has been received so far. It's been beyond my expectations, but it's been good so far.
I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to elaborate upon that last little bit.
So,
we so very rarely get heretics on this show.
Yeah.
It's usually us who are the heretics.
So, to keep it very simple, right? There was this one individual who I think he comes from Pakistan, or yeah, I think he comes. Basically, he got an institution. And so we have fatwa ministries, right? So these are ministries that are responsible for giving religious edicts. And he approached many apparently, and he approached one. They accepted. The rest didn't accept. They didn't accept his request to say that my ideas are heretical. Anyways, when the fatwa came out, it was read by many people, and many people unfortunately didn't buy it. Right? There are some people who bought into it, but then I wrote counter responses academically. The key problem is, and this is where my narrative falls in line with Joshua's narrative, is this idea that, okay, you can believe Adam and Eve are miraculous creations, no problem, right? That's a staple position in Islamic thought. No worries, okay. The difficulty that people have with is the idea of interbreeding, right? That did Adam's descendants interbreed with other potential hominins or human-like entities, Neanderthals, and all of that? Joshua's book, Genealogical Adam and Eve, make it crystal clear that data would be exactly the same, even if you believed in a miraculous Adam and Eve, no problem whatsoever, right? Scripturally, however, it requires you to look into the Quran and Hadith. And I make it crystal clear in my work that there's nothing in the Quran and Hadith that denies that possibility. Some people have reacted negatively to that, not to the level of calling it heretic, but they're unsure about that, right? And when that fatwa came out, I then showed that even in our own Islamic tradition, scholars talked about the possibility of demons and humans marrying and interbreeding. So if you believe that radical thesis, if we've entertained that radical thesis, what's the problem here? So my point is to show that, look, there are plausibilities. I actually defend the theological acceptability of creationism. I'm actually the first, I think, Muslim academic to produce an academic work defending creationism theologically. All I'm saying is that if you believe in evolution, this is an acceptable position to have. The only thing that I think is a red marker, theologically speaking, is to believe Adam and Eve had parents, because they violate clear scriptural texts. And I think that becomes like a red line for a lot of people. So I said, okay, even if you wanted to believe in Adam's miraculous creation and Eve's miraculous creation, you could still believe that interbreeding took place. That explains our genetic similarities. That explains a lot of things, and move on. So, and of course, I think that idea is new, that is still kind of going under discussion, but I think it's gaining traction.
We've talked about a lot of topics today. Can we just go back over? So we've talked evolution, we've talked, Big Bang cosmology, we've talked black holes in the Quran. There's a lot of things touched on today. And our listeners might be curious, where can we go as a next step? Where are some resources you would suggest to guide them sort of in the right direction for good Muslim apologetics?
Right. So I think there's a couple of things. Number one, I mentioned earlier that we had two big developments in 2023. One is the Islam and Science micrograph series with Cambridge Elements that's being edited by Nidal Gassoum and Stefano Becchiardi. Both of them are active members of Islam and Science, right? So that's one area that I recommend you go to. Number two, one is the upcoming book series that I have with Palgrave. And so this is a monograph series where we're accepting proposals for edited volumes, for monographs, even translations from other languages into English, so that people can access the literature more. We've already contracted 3 books with 4th on the way and 6 more under review, right? And this just only started a couple of months ago. So for instance, we have a book on organ transplantation. And now organ transplantation is very interesting, right? because in Islamic thought, there is a debate about whether, first of all, whether you can receive or donate organs. That's one question. And then the other question is, to whom can you donate to or receive from? Is it only Muslims and Muslims, or Muslims of the wider audience? So what triggered this question was, I think it was in Netherlands, where one politician said that Muslims are taking our organs but not giving them. In other words, there's this stigma about giving organs to non-Muslims, right? So this book deals with that very, very well. We've got another one, right? Artificial intelligence in Islamic theology. This is the first academic work that will be talking about AI and Islamic thought from a theological lens. We've got another one where, believe it or not, and I think this might surprise some of your listeners, we actually have a line of process theology in our tradition, in the Islamic tradition. Allama Iqbal is a very famous figurehead from Pakistan. He's known as a poet, but he actually adopted a process metaphysics similar to Whitehead, right? And so somebody's taking that metaphysics and, juxtaposing that worldview with ecology, evolution, and what have you. So there's going to be a bunch of stuff there. In addition to that, I strongly recommend keep an eye on Zygon and Theology and Science. These are the two big journals, and I'm working with both of them to publish special issues. We just had 2 special issues on Islam and science. One in relation to philosophy of science and how that might intersect with Islamic thought, and one on Islam and evolution. So this was a very special issue. So we had a book symposium in which we had 3 Jews, 3 Muslims, 3 Christians, a philosopher, a scientist, and a theologian from each set engaged with my book. And they all engaged with it very differently. Joshua was one of them, right? And I had a response article. So this was a phenomenal project, and I think it shows Abrahamic science engaged theology, Abrahamic science religion at a very high level. I think this will be an amazing resource for people out there if they want to do interfaith stuff, right? And then finally, you can always reach out to me on Facebook, Twitter. I can even share my contact details. Academia, that's where I usually post a lot of my stuff. And I always publish my stuff up there. So those, I think, are the big places to keep an eye on. Just to kind of plug this in, if you don't mind, this is my latest publication. I don't know if you guys can see it. Islamic Theology and Extraterrestrial Life. So this is an edited volume that came out with Bloomsbury. And it has 9 chapters that looks at if aliens are, if they exist, how might that impact the Islamic worldview? So this is one contribution. And I think it's the first academic contribution on the topic in English.
On that note, we're going to have a special talk with Shoaib about extraterrestrial life, but that's only for our Patreon subscribers. So if you're not subscribed, go to our website, spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com, and subscribe. We're going to get right into that conversation right now. Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, please consider subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review. We're an up-and-coming podcast, and every little bit helps. Also consider joining our Patreon page. Patreon sponsors have exclusive access to unaired episodes, different kinds of merchandise, the ability to suggest an episode, and even an hour-long interview with Jonathan and I. Check it out at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com and see what you're missing out on. Sound effects from zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.